Ever had a moment where you realized the person you were about to marry had never actually seen you? Not the real you, just the version of you they decided was safe enough to keep around. I have. And it started with a manila envelope. It was a Thursday evening in late October, the kind of evening where the air finally gets that first real bite of cold and you think, okay, fall is actually here now. My fiancé's mother had invited us to dinner at their house in Westport. The kind of house that has a name, not just an address. I'd been dating her son Garrett for 3 years. We'd gotten engaged 6 months before that dinner. I'd sat at that dining table probably 40 times by then. I knew which chair creaked. I knew his father liked his wine poured first. I knew to compliment the centerpiece because his mother, Constance, changed it every week and noticed if no one said anything. I thought I knew how to exist in that house. I did not know what was waiting for me inside it that night. Tell me, have you ever walked into a room feeling completely at ease and then watched in real time as every exit quietly closed behind you? Before we get into this, I want to know, where are you listening from right now? And have you ever been handed something with a smile that was really just a warning? I'll tell you mine. We sat down to dinner. Roasted chicken, green beans, a potato gratin that Constance made from scratch and accepted compliments about with practiced modesty. Garrett sat next to me. His father, Warren, sat at the head of the table. His younger sister, Paige, was there too, which was a little unusual. She didn't come to these dinners often. She was on her phone most of the time, but every once in a while I'd catch her watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I remember the candles. There were 3 of them. Tall ivory ones in silver holders, and they kept flickering even though no window was open. I thought about that later. The way things move even when nothing seems to be disturbing them. Dessert was a lemon tart. Constance had just set it on the table when she reached beneath her chair and placed a large manila envelope next to my dessert plate. We wanted to do this properly, she said, before the wedding. I looked at the envelope. I looked at Garrett. He was looking at his fork. It's a prenuptial agreement, Warren said. He said it the way you'd say it's just a formality. Casual, like it wasn't the kind of thing that required a whole separate dinner to spring on someone. Standard. Our attorney drafted it. It protects the family's assets, the business holdings. Nothing personal. I picked up the envelope. It was heavy. I could feel the stack of pages inside. We'd love for you to sign tonight, Constance said, if you're comfortable. That last part, if you're comfortable, was doing a lot of work in that sentence. It was the part that was supposed to make me feel like I had a choice. I set the envelope back down. I said, very calmly, I'd like to read it first. Of course, Constance said, still smiling. No one at the table was eating the lemon tart. I looked at Garrett again. This time he met my eyes. He reached under the table and took my hand, and for a second I thought, okay, he's gonna say something. He's gonna tell them this isn't how this is done. But he just squeezed my fingers once and looked back at the table. That was the moment. Not the envelope. Not the words. That squeeze. That was him saying, please, just go along with it. I smiled at Constance. I said, I'll take it home and look it over. She said, of course. I carried the envelope out to Garrett's car that night like it was evidence. We didn't talk on the drive home. I had the envelope on my lap the entire 40 minutes back to our apartment in Stamford. Garrett had both hands on the wheel and his jaw was doing that thing it does when he's decided something isn't worth discussing. I've learned over 3 years that there's a difference between Garrett not wanting to argue and Garrett being genuinely unbothered. That night, I couldn't tell which one it was, and that scared me more than the envelope did. When we got inside, I poured myself a glass of water, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened it. It was 11 pages. I'm a project manager. I read contracts for a living, not legal ones. But I understand structure. I understand what language is trying to do. I understand when something is written to sound fair while actually being something else. And this agreement, from the very first page, was something else. The short version, I would enter the marriage with no claim to any Whitmore family assets, holdings, or business interests, present or future. If we divorced, regardless of circumstances or length of marriage, I would receive a fixed lump sum, $50,000 and nothing else. There was a clause about my future earnings too. If I started any business during the marriage and it became profitable, a portion of that profit was considered community property and therefore subject to family trust considerations. My money, in other words, could become theirs, but their money could never become mine. I sat there at midnight rereading page 7 probably 4 times. I wasn't angry yet. I was something quieter than anger. I was doing that thing where your brain just keeps saying, wait, let me make sure I'm reading this right, because the alternative, that someone looked you in the eye for 3 years and still thought this was acceptable, is too much to take in all at once. I called my best friend, Roxanne, from college. She picked up on the second ring even though it was close to midnight, because that's who she is. I read her the lump sum clause. There was a pause. $50,000, she said. After how many years of marriage? Any number of years. Another pause. Tess, that's less than a year of rent. I know. You didn't sign it, right? No, you didn't sign it. I know, okay. I could hear her sitting up. Okay. Don't sign anything. And listen, before you do anything else, get your own attorney to look at this. Not someone Garrett recommends, your own person. I already knew she was right. I just needed to hear someone say it out loud. The next morning, Garrett left early for work. I sat at my desk with my coffee and I started searching. I found a family law attorney in Hartford, a woman named Patricia who had 47 Google reviews, all 5 stars, and whose website bio mentioned she'd spent 12 years as a corporate litigator before switching to family law. I called as soon as they opened and got an appointment for the following Tuesday. What happened between that phone call and Tuesday changed everything, though not in the way I expected. I was going through my email. I managed a lot of vendor communications for work, and I had a backlog I'd been ignoring. I was clicking through, half distracted, when I saw an email that had been forwarded to me by mistake. It came from an address I didn't recognize, but the body of the email contained a thread, and the thread included Constance's email address and Warren's and their attorneys and Garrett's. It was dated 8 months ago. I should have stopped reading. I didn't stop reading. The thread was about the prenuptial agreement. Specifically, it was about what the prenuptial agreement was designed to do. There was a line in the attorney's original draft summary that I kept coming back to. Primary objective is to ensure no transfer of trust assets to spouse in the event of dissolution or death, and to limit spousal claim in the event of Garrett's succession to the family holdings. In the event of Garrett's succession, Garrett's father was planning to hand over the business. Garrett was going to become very wealthy, and they had been planning for months before anyone mentioned a prenup to me to make absolutely certain I would have no legal connection to any of it. They weren't protecting what they had, they were protecting what was coming. I closed my laptop. I sat completely still for a long time. The coffee went cold. Outside, the neighbor's kid was riding his bike in circles in the driveway, and I could hear the wheels on the pavement, and I just watched him through the window, going in circles, and I thought about all the ways a person can be going somewhere while staying in exactly the same place. I didn't tell Garrett what I'd found. I didn't tell anyone except Patricia. I met with Patricia on Tuesday afternoon. I brought the agreement, printed. I brought a screenshot of the email thread. I sat across from her in a very quiet office that smelled like coffee and old paper, and I watched her face while she read. Patricia was the kind of person who kept her expression completely neutral while her eyes moved fast. When she finished, she set the pages down and looked at me. "You have 2 options," she said. "You walk away from this engagement, or you negotiate." "What does negotiating look like?" She leaned back. "It looks like you getting your own attorney, which you've done, and presenting a counteroffer. A prenuptial agreement is a contract. Both parties have to agree to its terms. You don't have to accept the terms as written. Can they just refuse to negotiate? They can. And if they do, that tells you something important about what this marriage would actually look like." I thought about that for a long time on the drive home. Here's what I knew about myself at 29. I had built my career from nothing. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Meriden, Connecticut. My mom worked nights at a hospital and days at a salon for the first 12 years of my life. I got into UConn on a partial scholarship and graduated without debt because I worked 20 hours a week for 4 years and because I was very, very careful. I had been careful my whole life. I knew how to be patient. I knew how to read a situation and wait. And here's what I knew about the Whitmore family. They expected people to be grateful. Grateful for the dinners, for the introductions, for being let into the circle. They had never once in 3 years asked me a single question about my work or my ambitions. They had asked about my parents. They had asked about where I went to high school. They had decided very early on what category I fit into, and they'd been comfortable with me as long as I stayed there. The prenup wasn't a surprise. It was just the first time they'd said the quiet part out loud. I called Patricia back the next morning. I told her I wanted to counteroffer. She asked me what I wanted. I told her. We spent 3 weeks building my counter agreement. Patricia was methodical and thorough and completely unbothered by the Whitmore name in a way that I found deeply reassuring. We addressed every clause. We matched the asset protection. I agreed their family trust and pre-existing holdings should remain separate because that was reasonable, and reasonable was important. But I removed the clause about my future earnings. I added a provision for spousal support scaled to length of marriage. I added a clause that if I left my career to support the household or raise children, that contribution would be recognized financially. I added language about what happened to jointly acquired assets. It was 9 pages. The night before we sent it, I sat in my living room and tried to imagine how Garrett would react. Part of me still believed he would look at it and say, "This is fair." Of course. "I'm sorry this happened the way it did." That was the part of me that still believed I knew who he was. We sent it on a Wednesday. Constance called me on Thursday morning. She did not call Garrett. She called me. Her voice was very controlled. She said she'd reviewed the document with their attorney. She said some of the provisions were unusual. She said she hoped I understood that the original agreement wasn't meant to be hurtful. It was simply about protecting what the family had worked to build. I said I understood. I said my counter-agreement was simply about protecting what I had worked to build. There was a pause. It was the kind of pause that means someone is recalibrating. "We'll be in touch," she said. She was not warm when she hung up. Garrett came home that night looking like he'd had a very difficult day at work. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd first read the prenup, and he said, "My mom called me." "I know." "She said your attorney sent over a counter." "She did." He looked at me for a long moment. "Tess," he said, "did you really need to get an attorney? I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't anger. It was something sadder than anger. It was the feeling of seeing something clearly for the first time and understanding that you've been half looking at it for a while." "Garrett," I said. They handed me an 11-page legal document over lemon tart and asked me to sign it the same night. "What would you have done?" He didn't answer that. "I want to marry you," I said. "I want to build something with you. But I'm not going to sign away my rights to do it." We sat in that quiet for a while. The refrigerator hummed. Upstairs, someone in the building was watching television. He said, "Can you just give them some time?" I said, "I'm not going anywhere." What I didn't tell him that night, what I hadn't told anyone, was what had arrived in the mail 3 days before Constance's phone call. My grandmother had passed away in August. She was 81, and she'd been sick for 2 years, and her death was quiet and expected and still completely devastating in the way that the deaths of people you love always are, even when you know they're coming. My grandmother, my mother's mother, had raised me as much as my mother had. She was the one who taught me to balance a checkbook, who made me memorize my social security number when I was 10, who once told me, very seriously, when I was 16, the most dangerous thing you can do is make yourself financially dependent on someone else's goodwill. She'd lived in the same house in New Haven for 50 years. She'd been a bookkeeper. She'd been quietly, privately, methodically saving money her entire life. She'd bought her house outright in 1987. She'd invested carefully and consistently for 30 years. I knew she had savings. I did not know the extent of them. The letter from the estate attorney told me. I sat on the floor of my hallway and read it 3 times. The total estate, after taxes and attorney fees, was $2.3 million. But that wasn't all. My grandmother had also held a life insurance policy that named me as sole beneficiary, and she'd been a co-owner of a commercial property in New Haven that had been sold 18 months before her death. The proceeds from that sale had been invested. Between the estate, the insurance, and the investment account, the total coming to me was just over $1.9 million. I'd known she loved me. I'd not known the shape of it until that moment. I sat on that hallway floor for a long time. Then I called Patricia. She was quiet for a moment when I told her. Then she said, "This changes your position significantly." It did, not because of what it meant for the negotiation, though it changed that too. It changed my position because of what it clarified for me about myself. I had spent 3 years feeling in the Whitmore house like a guest who was tolerated, like someone who should be grateful, like someone who should sign what they were handed and not make it complicated. I was not that person. I had never been that person. I had just been polite about it. I thought about my grandmother sitting at her kitchen table with her ledger books, adding up columns of numbers with a pencil, being careful, being patient, quietly building something that no one could take away. I thought about that a lot over the next few weeks. The Whitmore family came back with a revised offer. They'd made some concessions, the future earnings clause was removed, and they'd added a modest spousal support provision. But the overall structure was still heavily in their favor, and they'd added a new clause. Both parties were required to disclose all assets at signing. That last one was the one that mattered. I disclosed everything. Patricia presented the asset disclosure to their attorney on a Tuesday. By Thursday, I had a phone call from Constance. Her voice was different this time. Still controlled, but there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. "I wasn't aware," she said carefully, "that you had independent assets of that magnitude." "I know," I said. Garrett didn't know. There was a pause. I let it sit. "We'd like to schedule a time to continue the conversation," she said. I said, "I'll have Patricia reach out." I hung up the phone. I stood in my kitchen in the gray morning light, with my coffee getting cold again, and I thought about what my grandmother would have said. She'd been practical. She'd been plain-spoken. I think she would have said something like, "Sometimes the best thing you can do is let people reveal exactly who they are, and then decide what to do with that information." They had revealed exactly who they were, and I had all the information I needed. I ended the engagement 2 weeks later. Not over the money, not over the prenup, over the moment at the dinner table when Garrett squeezed my hand and said nothing, over 3 years of being in a family that looked through me instead of at me, over the realization that I had been making myself smaller in that house for so long that I'd almost forgotten what my full size was. Garrett cried. He said he'd had no idea how far his mother had gone. He said he'd been blindsided too. Maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. I don't know. I think about it sometimes. What I know for certain is that Paige, his sister, sent me a text the week after. It said, "I always thought you were too good for this family. I'm sorry it took this long for you to figure that out too." I've thought about that text more than almost anything else from that whole period. I moved out of the apartment in Stamford in December. I found a place in New Haven, a small one, close to where my grandmother used to live. I could walk to the coffee shop where she used to take me on Saturdays. I walked there the first morning in my new apartment, and I ordered a large coffee and I sat by the window and outside. The street was quiet and a little cold, and there was nothing waiting for me to sign, and no one expecting me to make myself more convenient. I sat there for a long time. I thought about how my grandmother had lived, carefully, quietly, in a way that meant something. I thought about the comment someone made once, I can't remember where, that money talks, but wealth whispers. I think she understood that. She never told anyone about the property, the policy, the accounts. She just built it, year after year, column by column. She left it all to me. And what she left me wasn't really the money. It was the proof that a woman can spend her whole life being underestimated and still end up holding every card. I'm still holding them. And I'm not signing anything I haven't read. I thought a lot about what it actually takes to stay quiet in a room where everyone expects you to fold. Not the kind of quiet that comes from not having anything to say. The other kind. The kind where you have everything to say and you make a deliberate choice to wait. That's a different thing entirely. That's not weakness. That took me a long time to understand about myself. When Constance slid that envelope across the table, she thought she was handing me a conclusion. Sign here. Stay small. Be grateful. And the version of me that had been sitting politely at that dinner table for 3 years, the version who always complimented the centerpiece, who always poured Warren's wine first, that version almost let her get away with it. Not because I was afraid, because I'd spent so long practicing a kind of careful, considered stillness that it had started to look like compliance even to me. But there's a difference between being patient and being passive. My grandmother knew that. She lived it for 50 years, quietly, with her ledger books and her pencil and her long view of things. Nobody at her kitchen table would have called her powerful. She didn't need them to. What I understand now, looking back at Constance's voice on the phone, tight and recalibrated, the morning after Patricia sent my financial disclosure, is that people who try to diminish you are almost always operating on incomplete information. They see what they've decided is there. They stop looking. And that's the gap. That's where patience becomes its own kind of strategy. Constance had made a judgment about who I was before I ever sat down at her dinner table. And every time I was gracious, every time I didn't push back, every time I smiled and passed the breadbasket, she took it as confirmation. She never considered that I might simply be choosing my moment. I'm not saying I planned it. I didn't. I didn't know about my grandmother's estate until months after the prenup dinner. But I'd been building something long before that night. A career, a set of skills, a way of reading a situation clearly and not panicking. Those things don't announce themselves. They just sit there, patient and solid, until the moment when they matter. That's what I want to say to anyone who's ever been handed a document designed to tell them what they're worth. The people writing those documents do not have access to all the information. They know what you've shown them. They don't know what you've been building in the quiet. They don't know who believed in you before any of this started, or what that person left behind for you. Not just in money, but in the understanding that a long, careful, unglamorous life built on your own terms is worth more than any room that expects you to be grateful just for being let in. Garrett cried when it ended. I believed him mostly. But here's the honest part. His tears were for something that was already over long before that kitchen table conversation. You can't spend years watching someone be looked through and then act surprised when she stops making herself easy to overlook. Roxanne said it best, actually. She said, "You didn't win because of the money. You won because you never stopped being yourself, even when it would have been easier not to be." I think that's right. I think that's the whole thing, actually. My grandmother's house in New Haven is gone now, sold as part of the estate. But the coffee shop is still there. I go on Saturday mornings sometimes, same table by the window, large coffee, no rush. I sit there and I think about her adding up her columns, year after year, certain of something that nobody around her could quite see yet. She was right all along. She just let the numbers prove it.